Anna Smith with a new approach for comprehensive modeling of molten salt properties.
Good morning, everyone. So this session is about simulation and modeling, but actually I will start with some experimental work, because I think you will agree with me that experimental work is really essential to build our models and to validate them. So the comprehensive modeling we are trying to do here is a modeling of the physical-chemical properties of the liquid fuel. I take here the example of the molten salt fast reactor, because this is the design we study in Delft within the sum of our project, but really this is a methodology and could be applied to any type of liquid fuel and design. This molten salt reactor is really well adapted to work with a thorium fuel cycle. We have really to look at a number of physical-chemical properties of the salt when choosing the fuel. We have to consider neutronic properties, we have to consider chemical and thermal properties, so chemical stability. We need a high solubility of the actinides. We need the salt to be compatible with the structure materials. We need a low melting point and low vapor pressure, a high heat capacity, and we also need good transport properties, especially viscosity and thermal conductivity. So then all the developers have different choices of the fuel with their design. For the molten salt fast reactor, the choice is a lithium, thorium, uranium salt, or lithium, thorium, uranium, plutonium salt. And this is just the starting composition. With irradiation, we have many fission products being generated. So we have here the periodic table, and you have in orange, in yellow, the salt-soluble fission products, but you can also form some metallic precipitates in pink, and you will form some gaseous species in blue. And you have not only this, the fission products, but you also have some corrosion products that might dissolve in the salt after some time. Because we use a nickel-based alloy, we can expect to have, especially with fluoride salts, some chromium dissolving in the salt, maybe some iron and molybdenum nickel. So we understand here that we have a very complex multi-component system. And this system also has a non-ideal thermodynamic behavior. This means that for the safety assessment of the reactor, we need to build comprehensive models of all the physical-chemical properties of the salt. And I'm very much interested in the molten salt structure. So the structure of the fluoride salt depends very much on the composition and the temperature. If we look at lithium fluoride, this is a strongly ionic liquid. But if we introduce some THF4, then we form a molecular liquid. We will start to form complexes with 7, 8, and 9 coordinated complexes. And we have a network of corner sharing and edge sharing polyhedra. And if we introduce something like beryllium, we'll have a polymeric liquid. So at low beryllium concentration, you will have mostly ionic species, but as you increase the beryllium concentration, you will start to form polymeric units. And you can see here, this is based on MD simulations. You see the chemical speciation as a function of beryllium concentration, and here is this polymer unit, and you see it really increases with the beryllium concentration. And you can imagine that this has direct consequences on the physical-chemical properties of the salt, especially a property like viscosity. You can see that the viscosity also increases dramatically with the beryllium concentration. So with this, in this work, what we are looking at is the relationship between the structure, the thermodynamic stability, and the physical-chemical properties of the salt. And we are looking at this relationship first with experiments. We couple this with modeling, and then we hope that this will serve as input to CFD, neutronic codes, and in the end, multi-physics tools for the safety assessment of the reactor during operation and accidental conditions. So I will start with the local structure studies that we do. For this, we have developed a dedicated setup in Delft, And I will present results on the lithium fluoride, thorium fluoride system, because for the molten salt fast reactor, this is the main major component of the salt. I will move to MD simulations, which I use to interpret the structure studies. And in the end, I will show you our coupled thermodynamic structural model. So for the local structure study, we use X-ray absorption spectroscopy, and we do this at the synchrotron in Karlsruhe in Germany. This is because for these experiments, we need a very intense and tunable X-ray beam. Because the salt needs to be investigated in the molten state at high temperature, we do high temperature in situ experiments. And for those with some technical background, we measure the absorption of the X-rays at the thorium L3 edge, meaning that we excite the 2p core level, and then we measure the incident X-rays, the one after the sample, and like this we know from the Beer-Lambert law, the absorption coefficient of our material. And this we can relate to the local structure properties. This is a short-range technique, so it's really very well adapted to liquids such as molten salts, which are highly disordered, which cannot be investigated with long-range techniques such as X-ray diffraction, which we know from solids, crystals. And these experiments are really quite challenging because we are looking at radioactive fluoride salts, which are also hygroscopic and corrosive at high temperatures. So because of this hygroscopy, corrosiveness, radioactivity, we have to do our experiments with 3 containments at the beamline at the synchrotron facility. The first containment is this boron nitride cell, which we have developed in Delft. It's made of 2 plates of boron nitride. So why boron nitride? That's because it's compatible with the salts and it doesn't absorb much X-rays at the energies that we are looking at. And these cells are airtight, leak-tight, and we make pellets which are really thin, which are pure, of 100 micrometer. We wanted to check, of course, that our first containment was a good encapsulation for our sample and that we had no leakage. So what we did is we melted the salts, and after the experiment we made a mapping of the thorium concentration in the cell by scanning in the X and Y direction, and while measuring the fluorescence signal of thorium at 17 kilo electron volts. And you can see here this mapping. So we have a pretty homogeneous sample with some regions where the thorium is more concentrated, but very importantly, the sample, the salt, even after melting, doesn't come out of the cell. And we also checked that with some contamination tests on the outside of the cell after the measurement. The second containment that we use is our furnace, which also allows us to go to high temperature and then measure our molten salts. So we place this cell here in the middle of an alumina tube. We have a heating coil around this tube to heat the salt, some molybdenum shields. We measure the temperature with a thermocouple placed against the cell on the back. And we have at the front and at the back of the furnace subcapton windows to allow the X-rays to go through and hit the sample. And the third containment that we have is a glove box, which you see here. So the beam from the synchrotron is coming here. It's measured in this first ionization chamber. Then it goes through the Kapton window, through the furnace, through the sample. Then with another Kapton window on the back, we let the X-rays pass, and we measure the signal in the second ionization chamber. We have a reference sample then, and in the third ionization chamber, we measure again the X-rays. This geometry allows us to make transmission measurements. So transmission measurements meaning you look at the signal before and after the sample, and also fluorescence measurements. You look at what we detect here in fluorescence with these fluorescence detectors. And this is very useful because you can then measure samples that are very concentrated and samples that are diluted. And we first measured THF4 at room temperature to compare the signals of fluorescence and transmission in black and red. And you can see we have a very good agreement between both sets of results. And with this data, we get information on the local structure, especially on the distance between the thorium and the fluorine. So you see here our results, here the distances. And because this is a solid, you see a first fluorine coordination shell here, and here is a thorium. So you see the thorium that you investigate is here, and you see the fluorine here, and a second thorium not very far. And we compared our measurements of the thorium-fluorine distance with some neutron diffraction data, which we collected in Delft, because we are very lucky to have a neutron diffraction beamline at our reactor, and we had a very good agreement there. So then we moved to measurements at high temperature. So we measured these compositions in the lithium-thorium system, and even 2 weeks ago we managed to measure pure THF4. So what we do is we go 50 to 100 degrees above the liquidus temperature, so above this temperature, and we measure in the molten state and after cooling and solidification. So this is the EXAFS signal. It's not so straightforward to interpret. So we make a Fourier transform of the signal, and then we get this one, which you saw also before. And so you have the thorium here, and here the radial distance from the thorium, and you see the first coordination shell here, and the second coordination shell here. So what we have in black is the molten signal, and in blue the solids after solidification. And what we see is that we have 2 coordination shells after solidification against only 1 in the liquid. And we also have a clear decrease in the amplitude. And this is really a sign that we were molten during the experiment. We also see a slight decrease in the radial distance in the molten state. So what do we do with this data? If it's a solid, the standard procedure is to feed the data with a structural model. So with this equation, the fitting parameters are the blue one. And then we optimize these parameters to get information on the nearest neighbor, so the number of nearest neighbor, their distance, and their thermal disorder. We did this with a very simple model with a single coordination shell, because we have only 1 in the liquid. And you see in black our experimental data, in red the fit, and a very good agreement. So with this we get information on the thorium-fluorine distance, on the number of neighbors, so an average of 7.3, and on the disorder. And this is called the Debye-Weller factor, and it's actually very high compared to what you would have for a solid. So this is a clear indication that we are in a very disordered system, which is expected for a liquid. The problem we have with this kind of equation for the liquids is that we have a correlation between the fitting parameters. So it's not so straightforward to feed the data and have really reliable results. So this is why we couple these experiments to MD simulations. And for this, we use the polarizable ion model. This model was developed more than 20 years ago by Paul Madden and his co-workers, and it's really very well adapted to ionic systems. And so such interaction potentials are derived from a semi-classical approach, so from electronic structure calculations. And they have been derived on lithium-beryllium, zirconium fluoride system, lanthanum fluoride, and LEF-THF4. So we have some collaborations with the co-workers of Paul Madden, which helped us with these MD simulations. Here are the interaction potentials, but I will not go into detail. So the very powerful thing about MD simulations is that you get a complete picture of a local structure, which you cannot get from the X-ray absorption spectroscopy measurements. With these measurements, we know that we have an average number of fluoride anions around the thorium, but we don't know the distribution of complexes. The MD tells us that we have 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 coordinated thorium, with mostly 7, 8, and 9 coordinated. And we can calculate the radial distribution function which is a bit similar to the information you get from the EXAFS. And with this, if the fluorine, if we set a bound cutoff distance here at the minimum of the radial distribution function, we can say that below this distance, the fluorine belongs to the coordination shell of the thorium. And with this, we can calculate the distribution of complexes as a function of composition. What we see is that we have mostly 8 coordinated thorium in the lithium-thorium mixture. We have more and more corner sharing and edge sharing polyhedra as you increase the thorium concentration. You can see here some simulations at 10% and 50% of THF4. So when we increase the lithium fluoride concentration, the lithium are the red ones, the yellow ones, the polyhedra are in green, and the fluoride anions are in gray. So you become sparser when you increase this concentration, and you have also more and more free fluoride anions. So what we do is to reproduce the thermal disorder in the liquid, in the MD simulation, we just accumulate a lot of atomic configuration and we average the results. So this is what we did with the potentials that were published in the literature. And you see again in black our experimental data, and in red the MD output. And you can see it's not so great. Huh? We have some differences, and we see that the MD is underestimating the thorium fluorine distance. So this, we see that we need to fine-tune the interaction potentials. And now I have a PhD student very busy trying to do that. But once we are confident about the interaction potentials of the MD, then it's great. It's a very powerful tool. We can calculate many properties at many composition and temperatures which we cannot always measure experimentally. We can get information on the local structure, on the density, on the thermal expansion. We can calculate thermodynamic properties and transport properties. So now, using the information we have on the local structure, the output of the MD, we construct a model of the thermochemistry of the salt. For this, we use the CALPHAD method, which is an acronym for calculation of phase diagram. What we do is that we express the Gibbs energy of the system with the Gibbs energy of all phases in the system, solid solutions, liquid, and we make a least square minimization of this total Gibbs energy. To construct this model, we need experimental data as input. We use structure data, phase diagram data, thermodynamic data as input into our model. And we have then all phases expressed with some adjustable parameters, which we optimize to fit as best as possible the experimental data. With this, we create a database, and then we can make application calculations in ranges of composition and temperatures which have not been measured experimentally. So I will focus only on the model we use for the liquid. This is what we're interested in here. We use the quasi-chemical model for the liquid in the quadruplet approximation. And this is a formalism that has been used at the GRC Karlsruhe since about maybe 15, 20 years to develop a large database on fluoride salts. And then more recently in Delft, we are also contributing to this database. And this formalism is very well adapted to ionic liquids. We have two sublattices, one cationic and one anionic sublattice. And the basic unit is a quadruplet with 2 anions and 2 cations. And what we look at, what we optimize in the model, is the excess Gibbs energy linked to what we call the second nearest neighbor interaction, exchange interaction. So if we have the N members here, and we mix them, we exchange these cations, and so we have some Gibbs energy terms related to this exchange reaction. And the terms here in red are the ones that we optimize. So you can see that this model has been applied to many fuel fluoride elements, fission products. Also recently we work on corrosion products, but it doesn't provide a truly physical description of the melt, because we know from X-ray absorption spectroscopy, from Raman and the MD simulations, that we have molecular species and polymers in the melt and not these quadruplets. So what we have tried to do is to build an advanced model where we introduce on the cationic sublattice some 7, 8, and 9 coordinated thorium to really reproduce these complexes. And for this, we introduce 3 quadruplets instead of 1 for each coordinated thorium cation. And it means we have more parameters to optimize. We have 3 second chamber exchange reactions. So here in white you have these experimental points in the literature, and in the line is our model, and you see we have really a good agreement with experimental measurements in the literature, phase diagram measurements, and we also have a good agreement on the fusion enthalpy data of thorium fluoride and this Le3 THF7 compound. Moreover, because we have so many parameters, we want to use as much experimental information as possible. So for liquids, we can measure mixing enthalpy data. For this, we mix lithium fluoride and thorium fluoride. We have pellets here in a calorimeter, and we heat up this crucible with these samples, and at some point the lithium will melt, and then we will form a liquid solution, and we measure the heat associated with this event. So here you have the heat flow of the calorimeter as a function of temperature and time, and here is the event when the mixing occurs. And this event is then the sum of the fusion of lithium fluoride, thorium fluoride, and the mixing of the two. And with a calibration standard, we can relate this heat flow signal to the enthalpies, and we can derive mixing enthalpies. So these are the red points here as a function of composition, and in the dotted line is the model which was developed by Elisa a few years ago at GRC Karlsruhe with the quasi-chemical model in quadruplet approximation. And now in red is our new model with these complexes, and you see that the agreement is still pretty good with these experimental points. There's a slight deviation here, but the error here is a bit bigger. It gets more challenging to measure samples with a high THF4 concentration. And finally, with this model, we can also reproduce the complexes distribution calculated from the MD. So this was the MD output, and the line here is our model. So you see, again, a good agreement with the MD. So with this, I'd like to conclude. What we do is we try to couple structure studies using X-ray absorption spectroscopy with molecular dynamics, which helps us to interpret the local structure, and with thermodynamics, experimental measurements by calorimetry, and finally, a CALPHAD thermochemistry model based on the quasi-chemical formalism. So this research is funded by the Netherlands Organization for Scientific Research, and I have to acknowledge the KIT Lightsource for the provision of instruments at the INE beamline for the synchrotron measurements, and also the Institute for Beam Physics and Technology for the operation of a storage ring. And here are my co-workers in Delft, and also KIT ENE as the scientific researchers at the beamline. CA, Philippe helped us develop this furnace, and the last two, Matthew and Ayman, are the ones helping us with the MD simulations. And with this, thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer your questions.
The MD simulations are using interatomic potentials that were fitted to thermophysical data?
No, that's a good question. They were derived from electronic structure calculations on solids, and they are supposed to be predictive, so they do not use any experimental data to feed the interaction potentials.
It's useful to see the EXAFS as a function of temperature, for example, because you mentioned and you show some very interesting results concerning the EXAFS of the molten salt, of thorium, the thorium agent factor, did you follow as function of temperature the degenerescence of the EXAFS?
Yeah, that's a very good question also. We have not done it so far, but we would like to do it because indeed the distribution of complexes will change with temperature. The question is how much. The challenge there is that we measure 50 to 100 degrees above the liquidus, but if we go much higher, we might get into problems with evaporation of the salt. And so this is a bit tricky. We want to be careful there. But then what we can do is if with the MD we have we are confident on our interaction potentials for a set of temperatures and composition, then we can be quite confident on the MD results also as a function of temperature for a given composition.
How far are you able to go? You talk about second shell, the third shell. Are you able to discriminate something? Because it's becoming very important for the presence of vacancies, which are the place where the gas are so
we can only see first and second coordination shell. We cannot go much further with the EXAFS. No. So then in a solid we go thorium fluoride and then thorium.
This is excellent work that you've done, by the way.
Thank you.
You had a slide where you had various thermophysical and transport properties as functions of temperature. Is that something that you'll be able to make available soon? Because that would be very, very helpful to the designer community.
So the interaction potentials, you mean the slide where I show the different results on viscosity. So this is already published in the literature because these are calculations that were based on the current MD potentials. I think there's the reference, so you can even find it. If I go back. Yeah, exactly. Here is the reference. So this work has been published in 2013, where they have then compared the existing measurements with the MD potentials. And what we see is there's a pretty good agreement for all these properties. The density is not agreeing so perfectly, and this can also be related to, of course, the distance between thorium and the fluoride cation. So we hope that when we fine-tune these interaction potentials, we will have to recalculate all the properties, because then it might change. And we hope that we can fit as well density as viscosity and thermodynamic properties.
Was it challenging to construct your cell or nitride? Were there suppliers that can really do that?
It was, yes, not so easy to manufacture, especially because we have one plate that is flat, and the other one has a reservoir of 100 micrometer. And so this was, I think, for them a bit challenging. And it was also challenging for us to actually make a pellet of 100 micrometer.
Did you do it yourselves, or did you work?
The pellet, you mean?
To make the cell?
No, it was so we made the drawings, and this was made by an external company.
Is it feasible in the incorporation of all these levels of modeling and fitting to also evaluate confidence intervals for the phase diagrams and systems of that?
So making some uncertainty analysis. I think we have actually somebody in our research group that is is an expert in the uncertainty quantification, and this is something we are starting to look at, looking at the effect of if we change a bit our optimized parameters, how much does it affect the phase diagram calculation and the thermodynamic properties. So this is something we are starting to look at.
Okay, I think we have to move on. Thank the
Thank
speaker
you.
again.